Richard Cerutti was watching a backhoe scrape open a hillside for a freeway when he saw bone in the wall. That was November 1992, San Diego County. Under 4 meters of silt sat a broken mastodon and heavy stones that had no business being there. The bone was too old for radiocarbon, so it went into a museum storage box, and it sat there for 22 years. Then someone finally dated it. 130,000 years, 10 times older than any human should be on that continent, and within 48 hours, the field went to work, destroying it. Cerutti was a field paleontologist for the San Diego Natural History Museum, and his job that month was boring in the way good jobs are boring. State Route 54 was being widened. Machines cut into the hillside. He watched the cut faces for fossils. That's it. Then a grader took a slice out of the bank, and something pale came out of the silt. He stopped the work. That's a real decision, by the way, telling a highway crew to hold while you look at a bone. He looked. Fossil bone, roughly 4 meters down, sitting in fine-grained sediment laid down slowly by water. Old. Interesting. Nothing that should keep anyone awake. Then he called for the museum's curator of paleontology, Thomas Demir, and then, a little later, they called someone who studies stone tools. That is a strange phone call to make about a mastodon. The excavation ran about 5 months. It was slow, careful, badly funded, and it produced around 300 specimens, bones, teeth, tusk fragments, and the more they cleared, the stranger the picture got. 2 femur heads, the round ball ends of the thigh bones, were sitting there unbroken, close together. Almost everything else was smashed. Around them lay cobbles, big ones, andesite and other hard stone, some weighing several kilograms, sitting in fine silt where cobbles do not simply arrive. Rivers that drop cobbles also drop gravel and sand. This layer was mud. So how does a 5-kilogram rock end up in mud next to a shattered mastodon with the 2 roundest, densest bones in the animal left carefully intact? There's more. The breaks were spiral fractures, the kind you get when bone snaps while it's still fresh and greasy, not dry and mineralized. And when the team laid the fragments out, some of the bone flakes fit back onto the parent bone. They refit. That sounds technical. It is not. A flake that refits means the bone broke right there, in that spot, and the pieces never traveled. It's the archaeological equivalent of a fingerprint still on the glass. The picture they were describing was ugly and specific. Somebody put a mastodon femur on a stone anvil and hit it with a hammerstone, which is exactly what people do when they want marrow. And here is where the whole thing should have exploded in 1993. It didn't, because they couldn't date it. Radiocarbon needs collagen, and this bone had almost none left. Every attempt failed, which already told them something uncomfortable. Failed radiocarbon usually means you are past the method's reach, somewhere beyond 50,000 years. But beyond 50,000 is not a number you take to a journal when your entire discipline has agreed that nobody was in the Americas before about 13,000 years ago. So the boxes went into museum collections, labeled, cataloged, shelved. For 22 years, the most explosive site in North American archaeology was a drawer. Then, around 2014, James Paces of the U.S. Geological Survey ran uranium-thorium dating on the bone. The idea is simple. Uranium seeps into buried bone from groundwater and starts decaying on a clock. Measure the daughter products, get an age. The number came back at roughly 130,700 years, give or take about 9,400. They ran it again, same window. That is not a date that adjusts a model. That is a date that sets it on fire. It put somebody breaking mastodon bones in Southern California while Neanderthals still walked Europe and modern humans hadn't yet left Africa in the numbers that mattered. The team published in Nature in April 2017, Stephen Holin, Demir, Paces, Cerutti, and others. And the response was not a debate, it was a demolition. Within days, the biggest names in the field were on record. Gary Haynes, Donald Grayson, David Meltzer, Vance Holliday, Michael Waters. The objections were not vague hand-waving either. They were surgical. No stone tools, not one recognizable shaped artifact, no cut marks, no human bone, no hearth. Nothing you could hold up and say, this was made. And then the objection that actually hurts. The site was in an active road cut. There were heavy machines meters away. In 2018, a team led by Joseph Ferraro published a comparison showing that construction equipment breaks fossil bone in ways that can look a great deal like deliberate percussion. I want to be honest with you here, because the honesty is the story. That criticism is good. It is the correct question. A hillside being carved open by a grader is the worst possible place to argue that stones hit bones 100,000 years ago. The team's answer was that the cobbles were sitting in undisturbed position, in a layer where they could not naturally occur, with impact scars, and that the refitting flakes showed breakage on site. Not later. Not by a machine that arrived in 1992. Both sides were making a real argument. Only one of them was going to be allowed to look reasonable. To understand why the reaction was that fast and that total, you have to know what the field had already survived. For most of the 20th century, the Smithsonian's Ailes Herdlicka spent his career killing early American claims, one after another. And he was mostly right. The Americas attracted bad archaeology like nothing else, misread geology, natural rocks called tools, outright hoaxes. A discipline that gets burned enough times builds antibodies. Then, in 1927, near Folsom, New Mexico, a stone point was found still lodged in the ribs of an extinct bison. Nobody could argue with that. The wall broke. A new one went up almost immediately, built at Blackwater Draw and named Clovis, and it said, about 13,000 years, no earlier, one migration through a corridor in the ice. That model was not stupid. It was built from the best evidence anyone had, but it hardened into something else. Ask Louis Leakey. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Leakey, the most famous name in human origins on Earth, backed a California site called Calico with claimed ages around 200,000 years. The field rejected the tools as geofacts, naturally broken rock. It cost him. The man who helped rewrite African prehistory ended his career, being quietly described as having lost his judgment in the Mojave. Nobody needed a conspiracy after that. The lesson was learned. Early dates end careers. Which brings us to James Adivasio and a rock shelter in Pennsylvania that swallowed 30 years of his life. Adivasio started digging Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in 1973. It is a textbook excavation, obsessively recorded, layer by layer, one of the most carefully documented digs in North America, and the deep levels produced radiocarbon dates that ran past 16,000 years. Some deeper still. The objection came fast: contamination. There is coal in that region. Particulate carbon from ancient coal can wash into sediments and drag a radiocarbon date older than it should be. Critics also noted that the plant and animal remains looked too temperate for a site that close to an ice sheet. Fair questions. Adivasio answered them the only way you can. He dated it again, and again. Dozens of determinations, running in correct stratigraphic order, younger on top, older below. No scrambling, no sign of the contaminant carbon anybody was proposing. Same answer. Test it again. Same answer. That was the problem. Because a clean sequence of dates is very hard to explain away, and the alternative, accepting it, meant the whole map was wrong. So the argument simply never ended. Adivasio spent decades defending one deposit. He wasn't defending a number. He was defending the idea that the map could be wrong, and that is not a scientific position, it's a professional liability. The wall did not break in Pennsylvania. It broke in a peat bog at the other end of the hemisphere. Monteverde sits in southern Chile, and Tom Dillehay began working it in 1977. What came out of that bog is not ambiguous chipped stone. Peat preserves things. There were wooden stakes, lengths of cordage, pieces of hide, plant remains including seaweed carried up from a coast more than 50 kilometers away, the remains of a structure, and pressed into hardened clay, a footprint. Small, a child's. The age was around 14,500 years. It is not just older than Clovis. It is 15,000 kilometers from the Bering Strait at the far southern end of two continents, which means people had to have entered the Americas long before that to walk there at all. For 20 years, the site was fought over. Then, in January 1997, a group of archaeologists, including some of the loudest skeptics in the business, flew to Chile and walked the site themselves. They looked at the sediments, the stakes, the stratigraphy. They accepted it. That is supposed to be the happy ending. It isn't. Objections kept coming afterward from researchers who hadn't been on the trip, and Dillehay's deeper level at Monteverde, with far older material, is still rejected today by nearly everyone. 20 years of a man's working life, and a panel of colleagues standing in a Chilean bog to be believed about a child's footprint. And while that fight ran, a site in Florida that had already been dismissed was sitting under a river, waiting. Page-Ladson is a sinkhole in the Aucilla River, and to excavate it, you dive. Black water, almost no visibility. Divers working sediment by feel with dredge hoses. In the 1980s and the 1990s, that work produced a mastodon tusk with what looked like cut marks. Long parallel grooves consistent with someone cutting the tusk out of the skull to get at it. The dates came back too old. The site was largely written off. Then, decades later, Jesse Halligan and Michael Waters went back down. New excavation, new samples, tighter stratigraphy. They published in 2016. The occupation dated to about 14,550 years, and this time they had a stone biface, unambiguously made by a human hand, sealed in the same deposit. Now, here is the part that reframes everything you've heard so far. Michael Waters is one of the sharpest critics of the San Diego Mastodon claim. He is exactly the kind of specialist who publicly took that 130,000-year date apart, and he is the reason Page-Ladson is now accepted, which tells you the skepticism actually works. It also tells you what it costs. 30 years, a site sitting under a river, correct the whole time, treated as a mistake, until someone with the right reputation went back and reproved it. The critics aren't a wall, they're a very slow door, and people spend their entire careers standing outside it. Up to this point, every one of these arguments has been about things a general audience cannot see. Molecules, sediment. Whether a flake is a flake, then New Mexico turned the whole debate into an image. In the Tularosa Basin at White Sands, in the dried bed of an ancient lake, there are human footprints, not one or two, trackways, hundreds of them exposed by wind, printed into mud that later hardened and was buried. And these are not abstract. One trail records an adult walking fast across wet ground, repeatedly setting down and picking up a small child, and you can see where the child's feet touch and where they don't. Another trail crosses the track of a giant ground sloth, and the sloth's path swerves. A mammoth trackway runs straight through human prints. You are looking at a specific afternoon, somebody carrying a kid past animals that have been extinct for 11,000 years. The dating team, publishing in 2021, radiocarbon dated seeds of an aquatic plant found in the track layers themselves. The result? Roughly 23,000 to 21,000 years ago. That is not a small adjustment to the timeline. At 21,000 years, the ice sheets were at their maximum. The route everybody had drawn on the map, the corridor through the ice, did not exist yet. A footprint is not an artifact. Artifacts can slide, wash down, get redeposited. A footprint is a person standing in one place at one moment, and it cannot move. The objection arrived within months, and it was a real one. Those seeds came from a water plant. Aquatic plants can take up dissolved carbon from old groundwater, the hard water reservoir effect, and come out dating far older than they are. If that was happening at White Sands, the prints could be thousands of years younger. That objection could have killed it. It sounded decisive. So they tested it to death. In 2023, the team came back with two completely independent clocks. They radiocarbon dated conifer pollen, terrestrial, from trees, breathing atmospheric carbon, immune to the lake water problem, and they ran optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the sediment, which measures the last time a grain saw sunlight. Nothing to do with carbon at all. 3 methods, 1 answer. Later work added further independent age control, some of it involving researchers who had raised the doubts in the first place. That is science functioning exactly as advertised, and it took a mountain of effort to defend something that was, literally, a set of footprints. Now the map has a problem, because in 2016, sedimentary DNA work on the ice-free corridor, the passage between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets, the highway every textbook drew, showed something awkward. The corridor was open as bare ground long before it was survivable. No bison, no forage, nothing to hunt or eat. It only became biologically viable somewhere around 12,600 years ago. Read that again. The route people supposedly used to arrive became usable after Clovis. The bridge appeared after the footprints were already on the other side. So they came another way. And the evidence for that has been quietly accumulating in places nobody was looking. At Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, Loren Davis has been excavating a site with dates around 16,000 years with arguments for older. The stone points there are western stemmed, a different technology from Clovis, with possible parallels in the Northwest Pacific. Off the coast of California, on Santa Rosa Island, human remains known as Arlington Springs date to roughly 13,000 years. And that island was never connected to the mainland, not at any sea level, which means somebody crossed open water to get there. That single fact quietly demolishes an assumption buried under a century of argument that the first Americans were pedestrians. And then there is the edge of the map. Chiquihuite Cave in northern Mexico is where a team led by Cyprian Ardelian published claimed stone tools going back around 30,000 years. Most specialists reject it. They think the objects are geofacts, naturally fractured limestone. That is where the consensus sits, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But notice what has happened. 20 years ago, that claim would have been unpublishable. Now it gets into Nature and gets argued about on the merits. The confidence that made such things unthinkable is gone. And if people were moving down a coastline, the evidence for it is not in the desert. It is underwater. At the peak of the last glaciation, sea level was about 120 meters lower than today. Every beach, estuary, river mouth, and campsite along that Pacific margin is now seabed. The most likely route into two continents is the one place archaeologists have barely been able to dig. Missing evidence is not proof. But absence of evidence in a place nobody can excavate is not evidence of absence either. Then the genetics started saying strange things. In Alaska, the remains of an infant from Upward Sun River turned out to belong to a population branch, ancient Beringians, that split from other Native American ancestors far earlier than the tidy one-wave story allowed. A group sitting isolated in the north for a very long time before anyone was supposed to be there at all. And there is one result nobody has explained. Several indigenous groups in the Amazon, the Cerutti, the Cerutti, carry a faint genetic signal that is closer to Australasian populations than to any other Native American group. It is small, it is real, it has been replicated, and there is no accepted explanation for how it got there. That is not evidence for a 130,000-year-old Mastodon site. It has nothing to do with San Diego, but it is a published, peer-reviewed anomaly sitting in the middle of the human family tree, and the honest answer is that we do not know what it means. Meanwhile, the old model went quiet. There was no press conference, no apology, no paper titled "We Were Wrong About Meadowcroft." What happened instead was slower and much harder to see. Museum labels softened, textbook wording changed from "the first Americans" to "the earliest widespread culture." Migration maps grew a second arrow drawn along the coast, thinner than the first. Newspapers stopped arguing for pre-Clovis and simply assumed it the way you assume gravity. The field did not lose, it adjusted, and it never went back to explain why the people who were right early had to spend 30 years being treated as unreliable. Which brings me back to a drawer in San Diego. The two femur heads are still there. So are the cobbles. So are the boxes Cerutti filled in 1993. And I have to tell you the flat truth about them. The 130,000-year claim is not accepted. Most specialists think heavy equipment is the better explanation, and their reasons are strong. There are no tools, no cut marks, no human remains, nothing that says made rather than broken. It may simply be wrong. If you take one thing from this, take that, but then take the second thing, because it's the one that actually keeps me up. Meadowcroft was called contaminated. It wasn't. Monteverde was called impossible. It wasn't. Page-Ladson was written off for 30 years and then vindicated by one of its own doubters. White Sands was going to be killed by a reservoir effect that 3 independent dating methods then buried. Every single time, the field said, not possible. And every single time it eventually said, fine, quietly, late, and without ever accounting for the years it took from the people who carried the evidence. So no, this is not a story about a conspiracy. Nobody hid anything. It is something more ordinary and more corrosive than that. A discipline so scarred by bad claims that doubt became the safe career move, and being early became indistinguishable from being reckless. The Mastodon may be nothing, a grater, a bad afternoon, a coincidence of stones, but it sits in that drawer unre-excavated because the rest of the deposit is gone. They poured the freeway over it, 4 lanes of State Route 54, running across the part they never got to dig, at speed, all day, every day. Whatever the answer was, it's under the asphalt now.